The Transatlantic Slave Trade and Capitalism by Elka, Ella, and Mia. Portuguese started the slave trade, taking slaves through the Atlantic Ocean.
The slaves were traded in cram boats fitting up to 400 people, with each only 4 square feet each of space. They had not so much room as a man in his coffin, which was quoted in 1791 before Parliament. Slaves were property of their buyers and worked hard, long, tortuous hours as farm labourers, as well as any other job such as housekeeping or skilled crafts. The life of a slave was dominated by terror and work, the average age of a slave living only to 23 years of age.
Causes: labour shortages in the European colonies. Europeans who settled in America were enticed by the idea of owning their own land and not having to work for other people, the fundamental elements of a capitalist society. At first, convicts from Britain worked in the land, but they weren't enough to satisfy the demands for workers, so the colonists turned to slave labour from Africa. The rush to produce sugar. Settlers in tropical parts of America found a crop called sugar, and it quickly became in massive demand because it was very cheap and a natural sweetener. Sugar could be made out of sugarcane, but the process was very intense and required a large labour force. With no workers prepared to take on this job, the colonies turned to African slaves. Racial attitudes. The idea of racial difference made it easier for people to justify slavery. The enslavement of Africans was justified by the belief that Africans were inferior to Europeans. People supported this statement by saying that Africans were more suited to work on the plantations and benefited from being looked after by the superior Europeans. Timeline: 15th century. The slave trade began with Portuguese and some Spanish traders taking African slaves to the American colonies they had conquered. 16th century. Britain's sailors become involved in the slave trade. 18th century. Around 6 million Africans were taken to America as slaves, at least 1/3 of them in British ships. 1713. The Treaty of Utrecht gave the people the right to sell slaves in the Spanish Empire. 1772. Lord Mansfield ruled that slavery was illegal in England. The Somerset ruled that slaves' liberty and status as a property of its master. 1787. The Committee of the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed. 1788. The Dublin Act limited the number of slaves a ship could carry. 1789. Wilberforce made his first speech against slavery in the Parliament. 1791. Toussaint Louverture successfully led the slave revolution in the French Saint-Domingues. 1807. After a huge campaign, the first mass public protest campaign in history caused the Parliament to abolish the slave trade. 1815. The Congress of Vienna made peace and agreed to abolish the slave trade. 1833. The British Parliament abolished slavery in the British Empire. 1886. British ships were banned from carrying slaves to French colonies. This reduced the slave trade by around 2/3.
Olaudah Equiano was a person who was kidnapped in about 1755 and sold to slave traders. He was about 10 years old at the time. He was transported to the West Indies and then on to Virginia in America. He was sold to a plantation owner first, but then quickly resold to a British naval officer. In this job, he became his owner's personal assistant and travelled everywhere with him. He was then sold to a plantation owner in the Caribbean. Equiano was promised his freedom, but it was never fulfilled, although he could buy his own freedom through saving money he had made by buying and selling goods. He was educated by 2 of his owners and learned to read, write, and do arithmetic. He wrote a book called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, the African, published in 1789 to help the campaign against slavery. James Penny was very active in the slave trade. Penny was involved in many different slave trade companies and was well known for his knowledge in African coasts. When the British government launched an inquiry into the slave trade in 1788, Penny was the representative for the views of the slavers. According to local historian F.E. Sanderson, he was a man of considerable stature in the town, highly regarded by his fellow merchants. His forthright views on the slave trade must have brought him to their notice as a likely delegate. In the evidence he gave the British government, he claimed that he found himself impelled both by humanity and interest to pay every possible attention both to the preservation of the crew and the slaves. He said that he allowed the slaves on the Atlantic slave route to play games and dance and sing. In 1792, he was presented with a silver appendage for speaking in favour of the slave trade to a parliamentary committee. Captain Luke Collingwood of the British ship from Zong ordered 1/3 of his cargo to be thrown off board to receive insurance money. The cargo was made up of 133 slaves bound for Jamaica. This case was brought to court not for manslaughter, but for the insurers who refused to pay up. This decision was made because Collingwood panicked about the fact that illness was going around his ship, killing 60, including 7 crew members, and many still getting sick. If Collingwood delivered dead slaves, he would earn nothing, but if he had lost them, the insurance should cover it $30 per head. The consequences for the transatlantic slave trade are 2.6 million slaves out of 12 million Africans who were captured. Over 55% were taken to either Brazil or Spanish South America, 35% taken to West Indies, less than 5% were sold in North America. The death rates for slaves were astronomical, with millions of unknown slaves dying before arriving to their destination. 1/5 of slaves dies on the Middle Passage across the Atlantic. Up to 50% die in the seasoning camps.
Concept. Capitalism is an economic system in which the government plays the second role. This means that people and private companies own and have responsibility of production, where they gain the profit. This system is a very materialistic concept, and it is a very competitive market. Capitalism plays a huge role in the slave trade. How buyers bought them for work or just because they wanted them for status or possession. The system's selfish concept also played a part in how people once viewed them, in a now called unhumanly racist opinion, by treating them as inhuman.
Primary sources. Figure 1 shows a map of where slave trade was the most intense in certain regions of Africa. The map also shows which countries Africans were being enslaved and traded to. This is a useful visual primary source to historians, as they will be able to understand more about how large-scale the transatlantic slave trade really was, and to clearly see who the slaves were being enslaved and transported by. Figure 2 shows an advertisement of the sale of a female slave in New York in 1797. This written primary source is valuable to historians, as it allows them to see a real-life account of slave trade and everyday life / goings on. This source gives a clear example of how slave trade was done in advertisements, as well as gaining a better understanding of how African slaves were treated so appallingly in society at the time.